Okay, so I'll start the session for today. Good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to have you all here. Welcome to the webinar on challenges and opportunities in POSH. I am Jayapura, partner Metis POSH Consulting Service, and we as a company are absolutely committed towards creating safe work environment at organizations. Before we begin our webinar, I would just request all of you to turn your video off and mute the background. It's a sincere request. Otherwise, the thought process just breaks. So I would request everyone to turn your video and mute the background. Speakers, please. And one more request is if you have any questions, you people can inbox me through your chat messages. What we'll do is, as we go forward, we will keep collecting all your questions. And in case we are able to complete our session on time, we will take up a couple of questions. But in case the time does not permit, we will answer all your questions back through email. I hope that's okay. That's what we've been doing in most of our webinars. Um, so I would just request everyone to please mute your speakers except for Ms. Meenakshi Arora. Okay. Ma'am, welcome. We have with us Ms. Meenakshi Arora, Senior Advocate on Records, Supreme Court of India. A woman of substance with a keen interest in women and child right issues. That's what is so striking about Meenakshi ma'am. Her hard work, her commitment, and her dedication to the cause of women and children, and most importantly, a desire to make a difference to all their lives is what has kept her on her toes throughout. In 1984, Ms. Meenakshi Arora got enrolled at bar and since 1986 has been practicing law at Supreme Court in India. In 1989, Ma'am qualified and became an advocate on records at the Supreme Court. She had also, for a brief period, worked with Goodwin and Sobel, an international law firm based in Washington, D.C. She has also been a partner at an Indian law firm called Hemant Sahai and Associates. Uh, Meenakshi Arora was also standing counsel for the Election Commission of India. Her involvement in NOTA brought about key electoral reforms, which is very significant achievement. In September 2013, full bench of Supreme Court headed by the then Chief Justice of India, Mr. P. Sadashivam, designated her as a senior counsel, senior advocate, being only the fifth woman to be designated so. Wow. She was also a part of the famous Sakshi case, which brought significant changes in law relating to manner in which children who were sexually harassed were treated. She was also the member of the drafting committee, which drafted the regulations, the gender sensitization and sexual harassment of women at the Supreme Court of India, Regulations 2013, to protect and provide grievance redressal to women lawyers from sexual harassment at the Supreme Court. Amongst her pro bono cases, she represented women's organization in Vishakha versus the state of Rajasthan, a landmark case that banned the sexual harassment of women in workplace. I welcome you, ma'am. Thank you so much for being a part of the session and agreeing to come.
I thank you for having me here today. Thank you.
So, ma'am, I would like to start off by requesting you to share some key takeaways from the experience of handling the Vishakha case. If you could show some inputs, share some inputs which will be beneficial to our participants.
The case has its own history, how it came about here. Vishaka case didn't start with just a thing of a sexual harassment. That was a case of a woman who was engaged in a work of preventing child marriage, and while seeking to prevent a child marriage, the family of the child, the girl and the boy retaliated against her, and she was gang raped by the men of those families. Now, you know, everybody just wanted a CBI inquiry because this happened in Rajasthan and it was all divided on caste lines. They were upper caste, this woman was a lower caste. So the only objective that the NGOs had at that time was an independent investigation. But when the matter came, the thought, and we didn't have CEDAW at that time. So the thought that crossed our minds was, If a woman's only doing her job, is she not to be afforded a protection so that she can do her job to the fullest? And then if something like this happens, what is then the responsibility of an employer? Or where does the employer step in? Because there was nothing there in law to take care, and neither was the government who had engaged to carry out this work as a Sathin was stepping in to take up any responsibility. So in that whole petition, to have CBI inquiry, independent inquiry, we bunched in this one paragraph and one small prayer. Now, by the time the matter came up before the court, the government had itself directed the matter to go for CBI inquiry, so the main case was already over. But the judge had read the petition and he had read this one paragraph. And he says, this is what we want to consider. And he still entertained the petition for that one paragraph and that one prayer, which today gave you the Vishakha judgment for all of us here, and then subsequently the act that came in 2013. So that is the background on Vishakha. But if I say that, what do I have a takeaway on dealing with that? I would say that, what was important was that our judges were aware. The judges were sensitive to the issue. They were alive to the issue. And they did realize that women could be exposed to such dangers. And that time we were talking about dangers. Now, the wider part of the harassment comes much later. That women could be exposed to such dangers in course of their work, and there was a need to set certain guidelines, or at least put in something which would afford them protection, remedy, access to justice in that particular position. But this was 1991-92. Vishakha judgment comes in 1997. The most important thing between 92 and 97 was that Justice Sujata Manohar, who was a part of that bench, attended the Beijing conference. When she came back from the Beijing conference, she came back with what the whole world was looking at, and CEDAW had come in by which time. Now, all this together and government having ratified CEDAW gave us an impetus and a push to have the present current guidelines as they have happened now. So, awareness, familiarity with international developments, the manner in which things are being looked. I'm not saying we copy them, we have our own conditions which prevail here, but to keep in sync with developments and recognize that certain rights are not being recognized here is a very important fact. And that is a very important take from this whole procedure.
Sure. Thank you so much, ma'am. So, while drafting the provisions of the POSH Act, I just wanted to know that if the entire spectrum of organized and unorganized sectors were looked at equally, because what happens is whenever we as consultants conduct the awareness sessions in unorganized sectors or probably the factories in remote areas, people usually do not question us about the neutrality of the law and probably accept it just the way it is. But what happens is when we do our awareness sessions in corporates, typically from the metros or urban areas where companies, most of them have gone for neutral policies and lots of women at the positions of power. Employees there in such companies do question us about the reasons for absence of neutrality in the act. Somehow they seem to be concerned and worried. So what is your take on the gender neutrality, ma'am?
Jaya, I missed you a little bit, but I think I've got a broad gist of your question because the link was not good in between somewhere.
Okay.
See, when we did the Vishakha guidelines in 1997 under the Supreme Judgment, we were very clear at that time that we could not address the unorganized sector. We knew our limitation. We had no means of reaching the unorganized sector, and that was something that bothered me even at that point in time because we have a very large workforce in the unorganized sector. So the Vishakha guidelines, now I will come to the act also, but I'm just putting you in that historical perspective. So there are two things that we were very clear about at the time when we were doing the guidelines, which were accepted by the Supreme Court and then came out in the judgment, is we did not want a criminality attached to it. And there was a reason why we did not want a criminality attached to it. And the second thing was that we felt that we were not, we didn't have the wherewithal, even if we got the guidelines, to be able to implement it in the unorganized sector. Criminality, now why? We said we do not want it, but that has come today in the 2013 Act, so I'm going to compare and contrast the two for you. We felt that the minute you attach a criminality to that whole process, it takes you into a different realm altogether. And the efficacy, the rigidness of the actions, of the procedure, starts to then tie up with the complaints. Because understand, once you have a criminality that is attached, then there is always a right of the accused, which the test of that defense is much different in that particular case. So the minute you put criminality with it, is a prosecution that then establishes beyond reasonable doubt. All those tests start coming in. And just like you would say in all other criminal offenses, whether it is rape or the other, the rate of conviction becomes abysmally low. So, that was our idea. And we said we rather have it as a civil process or a wrong than to attach criminality. But the government, in its wisdom, when it did frame legislation, it has brought in the criminality, and it also included within it the very, very large unorganized sector. So let's talk about the unorganized sector, and the criminality is a test. I think it's been about 7 years, and I don't see so much has been reported in terms of the criminal thing. So we really do not have much that's happening on that side. And I think it's more still the in-house procedures within the company, which are taking recourse to the implementation of the act rather than the criminal process. And also, so far as the options that the government framed, and that's coming back into the unorganized sector. See, I still feel that the unorganized sector is not yet adequately addressed. What is the address that the unorganized sector has? A complaint that is made to the district magistrate or an officer, who can be a district magistrate, collector, etc., and who in turn then refers it to the committee which is appointed under the statute. I know for the longest time there were no such committees. And in any case, have we gone about the way we went about on Vishakha guidelines at that time and gave it enough publicity? The court said give it publicity, made it compulsory that within that you have sessions of training your staff, making awareness as to sexual harassment. We haven't done all that exercise in the unorganized sector. So women are still not aware that they have a remedy. Number two, even if you have put out a remedy under the statute, that whole system is not yet ready to be able to provide for that particular remedy. So that's one area I feel we have fallen back very.
One second, ma'am. One second, ma'am. I request everyone to please mute your speakers.
So I will just wrap it up by saying that the local complaints committees have not really worked out in a manner. I mean, they could be very, very useful tools to meet with the redressal on the unorganized sector. But I think there is a lot that is required to be done on that front. But yes, the act has worked out wonderfully, where in the organized sector, in the companies, in public sectors and other places, where women have come to recognize that they have a, having said that, I'll just add one thing here. When we started with the understanding sexual harassment way back in 91, 92, women knew that they had a right to protest against certain acts. Like, for example, there were lots of complaints. Women would say that when we go to our superior's room or we go to a colleague's room, there is a pornographic magazine on the table. We know it's wrong. We know it's like we are not comfortable about it. But they didn't have a name for this particular action and how to deal with it. So the Vishakha guidelines and now the Act gave them that remedy. Yes, this is a harassment. I have a right to protest and I have a right to say no. So it's worked out actually wonderfully from something that can be very subtle to something that can be very gross, which can be identified as a harassment. There is an acknowledgement, there is an understanding that it's a right to say no and to make an objection. And then, of course, the procedure, which we will discuss as we go on, which has formulated.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. Ma'am, am I audible clearly?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to understand when the entire team was drafting the regulations for the Supreme Court, were there any specific challenges that you encountered?
Yes, Supreme Court had its own challenges, undoubtedly. The Supreme Court had two challenges. Number one, we really had to tell the apex court that 16 years had gone and they didn't have a guideline. They didn't have a sexual harassment guideline for themselves. But we had a very good Chief Justice who took it very kindly because I remember telling him very candidly to his face in the court that you are the apex court and you have to lead from the front. So if the Supreme Court of India doesn't have its guidelines, what would you expect of the judiciary across the country? So for a moment, he didn't look very happy, and then he came around and he says, "Okay, tell me what do you want us to do?" And he said, "Frame your guidelines." So that was the first challenge, was to tell them, like, guys, you haven't done your homework. You announced the law in 1997, and we are quite 16 years from there, and we have no guidelines in this place. So that was the very first challenge, but that was easy enough to overcome. The second important challenge that happened with Supreme Court was Supreme Court's different from having your organization or your company. Your company can have a policy, you have an employer, you have an area of work which is defined, and of course the Act now takes care of areas that we had always envisaged, official work outside of your company or where you are traveling for the company, you are doing, so it takes care of all that extended areas of work. Supreme Court had two issues. Number one, the Supreme Court precincts, the chambers, the registry. Then it had two aspects. It had its own staff, and it had lawyers who were not necessarily its staff or other people who were visiting the Supreme Court, the women who were visiting the Supreme Court, and if they should be harassed, what would that be? So were the few challenges that were addressing framing of the guidelines, which of course the court went as far to say that even if there are some clients who come in, women who come in for seeking remedy or are litigants, and if they should be harassed, they also will have an access. And of course, the women lawyers working at the Supreme Court, the women clerks working at the Supreme Court, and of course, the staff of the Supreme Court have their own their own committee to deal with that. So those were slightly different aspects than what you would have in a normal.
Okay, great. So, so how do you see this entire Prevention of Sexual Harassment at Workplace Act evolving in the coming years, ma'am? Do you see, because there are many cases, coming to you as well. So, do you see any specific areas of concern currently in the way it is interpreted in the court of law?
Yeah, there have been cases that have come up recently. Uh, See, the Me Too movement has again had its own impact on the sexual harassment. So there are two facets to it that I would kind of say that happens now? Speaking for myself, I think the first and foremost thing should be the preventive measures that should be in place. But what happens that once a complaint comes in, and how the complaint is then addressed and how the courts are looking at it? One very interesting thing that has happened, and I think is going to, it's something that I would look at it for the future, how it pans out, is the she box, which the government has come out with, which is the sexual harassment electronic box, and it's an online platform by Ministry of Women and Child for reporting complaints of sexual harassment, which can be used by both the government and the private sector employees. And the minute the complaint comes there, the government can then direct it to the employer, and it can even monitor the progress of the complaint and see how it is working out. Now, this will be a very interesting tool to watch, and I'll tell you where this will be a very interesting tool to watch. Women working at very senior levels in organizations, or where a complaint is made against a very senior officer. Am I still there?
Yes, ma'am. We are able to hear you.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. Suddenly the network was gone. That's why. Where a woman makes a complaint against somebody very high up in the ladder in the organization, let me say the top management thing, and she finds it very difficult to get her complaints addressed. This is one thing I would see how this pans out, because there have been cases that where women have made complaints against people in very high positions, people who the organization could not dispense with, and women felt that they were not finding their redressals there within the organization to their complaints. So this is going to be one aspect how it's going to work out. The other part of it that is happening is how the courts are going to look at these complaints when the matters travel from the internal complaints committee to the court. Now, the internal complaint committees, you can train them. You can have people who will be trained how to deal with sexual harassment guidelines, understand the finer nuances. They will of course be trained to deal with principles of natural justice, etc. So those would be more or less a specialized bodies. But when you travel to the court, you will have to have a sensitization of the judicial members there also to look at these cases which will come up there. And that necessarily is not there as of now. I'll be candid. We do have programs which are there by the judicial academies, but the manner in which some of the cases have been handled do not really show that sensitivity on that particular subject. At the same time, the Me Too movement has thrown out another thing. Very often, the Me Too movement has brought a discredit or credibility, and so does the current statute. The current statute recognizes that if a complaint is found to be false, then there can be measures against the complainant, because after all, it destroys the reputation of another person. So these are the two areas which the courts will have to now work on as to how they have to be harmonized, because it is not that there are no cases of false complaints. There could be definitely cases of false complaints, but at the same time, all complaints cannot be looked with a jaundiced eye, which very often can happen, which is like stereotyping issues where women complaints are concerned. Stereotyping is a huge issue there, and the recognition then by the courts how they look at it.
Okay. Lovely. Thank you so much, ma'am, for those inputs. So, my very, very important question now is, what should the, am I audible, ma'am?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So what should the organizations specifically do to empower the IC members of their companies so that they make the right decisions? Of course, training is one thing, which we all know. But is there something else that you want to share from your end, which could make a lot of difference to the IC members specifically? Specific inputs, specifically what organization should do to empower them?
First of all, I don't think we need to get into the method of selection of your committee that's there in the statute itself. So there's no point repeating that whole thing. And I'm sure most of our people attending here today may have some familiarity, but they know that is to be headed by a senior level woman officer. They have to have one independent member from outside, and 2/3 of the members of that committee have to be women, etc. All that is there. But at the same time, you have to have one person with some legal background. So that's a part of a training, but that's a specific training. So having one person with a legal background is very important, because that will help you uphold your recommendations or findings of your internal complaints committee, since the legal person with the legal background will ensure that you follow the principles of natural justice, that you can show that there are no biases in the conduct of that process, and you overcome those legal hurdles, which will come up in that. So that's one thing that I will always advise any organization. The law today also recognizes that, but have a person who has a background on the legal issues to avoid this particular pitfalls, so that you can comply with the legal procedures. You can give opportunity of hearings, give them the opportunity to file their representations, examine the witness statements, and give those opportunities to bring the evidence on record, etc. Now you come to what are the qualities that you would have in the member. I think the first and the foremost quality that you must look in your committee members: sensitivity on both sides, and complete fairness. That you do not have people who have any kind of a bias or prejudice against any one of the side, and have an open mind to a complaint. Which is very important. And second thing, the person must be, that of course will be a part of the training, to understand the women issues, have a knowledge about sexual harassment. The issues that affect the committees very often is something like subconscious biases, something like stereotyping. Oh, but men tend to do it like this. Oh, but if you were wearing such and such dress, then the quote unquote woman of a certain character, all those ideas, those stereotyping of a person, preconceived notions, all are there. So those are the facets that you have to see, that your committee members have addressed within themselves, and do not have that. Remember one thing that they say about the judges. They say that every judge comes with his own baggage. And what is that baggage? That baggage is the background from where he comes. So if he's grown up in a household which was abusive, he doesn't think very much about an abuse. He says, "Ye to hota hi hai." So you have to get rid in your committee member, consciously bring about this facts and identification, that if you hold any such biases, well, it's a bias, you need to address it. So preconceived notion, and so that kind of a training is very, very important. The inherent value of fairness is very, very important to possess, so that they can make. And second, lastly, please insulate them from the top management or from any external factors, so that they can take their decision without being affected from any kind of an external pressure or any kind of managerial issues. They are independent, and they can take a fair decision in their committee that they constitute. So that's what I would recommend here.
Lovely. Thank you, ma'am. So, ma'am, you were talking about principles of natural justice. So now that's a very important and interesting topic to discuss, because most of our audience today would love to know, how does this entire principles of natural justice work? I mean, if you can guide us on what does it mean for IC members while conducting inquiries and conciliations, it'll help them a lot.
Yeah, when we talk about principles of natural justice, we clearly mean that you have to give opportunity to both the parties. When a complaint comes before you, the complaint has to be shared with the person who has been accused of the act of harassment. He has to be given an opportunity to file his defense. And of course, the complainant can file the rejoinder. Now, that is the part of the pleadings, and I'm sure most of you know about that. Once you record the statement of the complainant, please share a copy of that statement also with the person against whom you are proceeding. Similarly, his statement has to be shared with the complainant. If you should record, both the sides may have their witnesses, or they may have their persons whose statement they may want to be recorded. When you record these particular statements, it's important that you exchange, those statements are exchanged on both the sides. Once you have exchanged all these materials, so both sides have the full material which is before the committee, on which the committee has to arrive at its conclusion, give them the opportunity to give their representation as what is the material stated by the other side, how that material in their view may be right or is not right or is wrong. So both of them put in their final submissions to that material that has emerged. Some committees can have a small course of final oral hearing after all that material has come, if they so choose to. Others can ask them to put it in writing if they want that. But the opportunity must be equal on both sides, and the material which is placed on record, you are required to share it with both sides. So you cannot have, one side material which you want to use to arrive at your decision, but you do not give it to the other side, because the other side has to have that opportunity to tell you why this material is not correct, or there is something more to it that should have been informed to you, etc. So therefore, that exchange is the most important facet of your natural justice process here. An equal opportunity of hearing to both sides. So if you're hearing one, please hear the other. You can't do that, I'll hear one and not hear the other.
Right. So, in fact, there have been occasions where a victim has been heard, but I think not enough time has been given to the alleged harasser. I think though people know about this concept of principles of natural justice, but I think somewhere because of lack of time, people tend to miss out on those important steps of sharing the complaint copy with the alleged person, or giving him time to get back with his side of the explanation. So I'm sure a person like you sharing your inputs and telling strictly that yes, this is required, I'm sure it will be a great input to all the committee members, ma'am. Thank you.
Also, they must not forget one thing, Jay, that
Mhm.
if they do not follow the principles of natural justice in the course of their committee, their report which will go will suffer a challenge. And in that challenge, one of the fundamental principles to set aside anything is the violation of principles of natural justice. So that
Absolutely.
report itself can be set aside and it will be worthless piece of paper. So they do not want to have that after having gone through that entire exercise. They don't want their report to be discarded only because they didn't give an opportunity. I'm quite sure no committee wants that.
Yeah, absolutely. So how has been your experience with situation like today's, where complaints are registered online, inquiries are being done online, ma'am? Do you think uh, uh, we can do justice by doing everything online, or do you still stick on to the in-person inquiries which are, which we followed traditionally. So what are your inputs on doing things online? Because now people are not, everyone's working from home. At least most of the customers of ours or IT companies, they're all, starting off only by by March. So it's very impossible. I mean, it's impossible to keep a complainant waiting till then. So most of them are doing things online, but I just wanted to ask your opinion on how do you think these online inquiries are working? Uh, your inputs on them?
Um, the courts have started working on virtual mode. And if the courts are working on the virtual mode, then the ICC committees are comparatively much more insulated than the court process. So to say that the judicial system can work online, but an ICC will not work online, will not buy me any, safeguard. No, but having putting the humor and the joke about it aside, online has its advantages and some disadvantage. On the side of advantage, you can actually complete the whole procedure quite seamlessly, and we have seen that working out. And believe me, from the initial reluctance, apprehension, all of us have taken to virtual hearings like virtually fish to water. Believe me, as a woman, I have been saying that I find them better because in the court, my male colleagues can drown out my voice because they're so much louder than me. But on a virtual hearing, they cannot because their system is muted. So I get my full say. But so the procedurally, the hearings can be carried out just as well as they can be carried out in a physical. The small area that I find is missing, and that will be much more in ICC. It is in a recording of the statements. It's very important to see the body language. It's very important to see the reactions. The empathy is very important. The physical presence always has certain, everybody has their way of communicating. Now, virtual does take away, not to a large, but to some extent on that. And that's one drawback that I see on the virtual. Other than that, I think the virtual hearings are as good and effective so long as you have sensitive members who are trained to recognize all of this. I don't see any reason why you should not be able to do them on a virtual hearing.
Oh, lovely. So, ma'am, since we are talking about principles of natural justice, so if the IC has followed the principles of natural justice to the T, but somewhere in between there have been certain procedural lapses, say, so would the courts look at the principles of natural justice being followed, or would they be as strict with the processes which have been broken down? So, how do they look at it?
No, the courts are not looking at you to go into a manner which is, they would want to see that for the fundamental principles of natural justice have been followed. Because understand that that law would come from those which come for the in-house inquiries, which you carry out in respect of an employee, where you give the employee an opportunity for the labor matters. The inquiry officers are appointed who carry out the inquiry. They have always held that you have to basically follow the natural justice principles. So exchanging, opportunity of hearing, all that, yes. But there is also one other principle, remember, where they have held that it can be a futile or a useless exercise theory in natural justice, which are those extreme cases that even if I had given you a hearing, there could have been no different approach than this. Okay. So there the courts have also taken a view that it would be an exercise in futility. But remember, that's far and between. That's not an often thing that court recognizes, but the broad principles of pleadings between the parties, everything that the committee is going to arrive at its judgment one way or the other, whether in favor of the complainant or against the complainant, has to be shared between both the parties, because that is your decision making process and that has to be shared. And please don't change your committee member as far as possible in between, because if you should change a committee member, the opportunity, if you have given any of oral hearing, will be required to be given again once the new committee is constituted. That is, if you are hearing them personally. So you will have to give that opportunity again, because the principle is the committee that here is the committee that decides. So it cannot be that one committee heard and one member went off and you got a new member in and that gave a decision. That will not work. It will be set aside immediately.
Got that. Sure. So, ma'am, we have also heard about the reasonable woman standards, and we see them in all the books related to the sexual harassment at workplace on the reasonable woman standards. So, I wanted to understand from your perspective, how and when do we apply it during the course of investigation?
No, I didn't get your full this thing. You were on the principle of?
Yeah, so while looking at the reasonable woman standards, we have heard about this in most of the books as well, and some of the decisions, recommendations that people have taken, they have looked at reasonable woman standards.
Yes.
So I wanted to understand how and when do we apply this reasonable woman standard during the course of our investigation?
Uh, when you start with the witness recording of the evidence, you can start questioning at that particular stage on the basis of those standards. When you're recording the statements, you are entitled to put the questions there. And then your decision making process becomes actuated by those standards. Your decision making process has to be the manner in which you will arrive at your final decision will take into consideration the various standards that you would apply there. Now, like for example, let's test out some of these, out here. If you take the standards on a place, if you have the illustrations, now it's not just coming to my mind at this point, but let us take an illustration of what is the nature of a complaint. A complaint could be anything which will go from an oral statement or just a statement which you perceive that is a harassment, down to a one which can be a touch, to a much larger aspect of a thing, to making gestures, to whatever else, the entire gamut comes into with it. The principles that have said is that what a woman perceives as a harassment, the perception is hers, whether it is a harassment or not. Now, this is an area that becomes quite vexed, because somebody perceives it as a harassment, but some may not perceive it as a harassment. Now, therefore, in terms of the new law, if a woman is not able to prove that she perceived it as a harassment, but she is not able to bring about enough material to show that there was actual case of harassment, then it is one aspect. But if it is found that her allegation or her complaint is bereft of any material whatsoever, the committee may well arrive at a finding that it's a false complaint. So, the standards that you will apply, there is what? I'll give you a simple illustration. Without naming anyone, we had a simple case where the employee kept saying that she was being harassed by her superior officer. And her case was that he would call her to his room at the fag end of the day, where all other staff members had gone. Now, she had no witness, she had no way of proof. So, the unexpected witness source came from the peon in the office, who said yes, at the close of the day she would go and hide in the washroom. There was a call, she would say, tell him I have left. Now, the woman's perception that because she's being called at the end of, and there is a demand that come out for a dinner with me or join me for a tea after this, is her perception of a harassment. And she doesn't want to go there. But she has no way to prove that because it is something that has happened within that one room. The the actual harassment has taken place just in the room. So what will be then the test that the committee will apply to arrive at that? Now here was the witness of a particular peon who said no, she would be run to the washroom and she'd say, don't call me, I don't want to go just now. So it just varies from matter to matter into how you deal with the whole thing.
Sure, I understand that. So now another, I think a concern that has been raised by many people is the IC gives a recommendations post a complete inquiry. So how binding is the IC recommendation to the employer? Because if you look at the act, it does not
Yeah.
specify this. Like section 13 for only talks about an employer to act on the recommendations within 60 days. But can the
Yeah.
employer modify or increase or decrease the quantum of punishment or recommendation which is recommended by the IC? And if the management modifies, increases or decreases, what could be the repercussions?
See, we must not forget the earlier judgment of the Supreme Court in Medha Kotwal. In Medha Kotwal, they had clearly said that this particular recommendation is then to be taken in conjunction with your own service rules. So every large organization has its own service rules for its employees in terms which are given to every employee. And most organizations have today amended their service rules to put down as to be what would be the nature of penalties which would be visited in the event of a sexual harassment, because now sexual harassment becomes one of the issues of penalties, which between a small, on a salary, you can withhold certain amounts, or you can even lead to termination in a major thing. So the question is, on the recommendation, what will be done by the committee, you would have to do it with your service rules. And if now again, between the minor and the major, there is a huge issue, because a woman may perceive that to be a major harassment, the committee may hold it's a minor harassment. There the company will have to go by its own rules to see that if the committee has recommended that it's a minor case of a harassment, then the penal provisions, even as per the company's rule, can't go beyond its minor, irrespective of then what is recommended by the committee. Ordinarily, your committee will not recommend anything that will go beyond your service rules, because I'm sure they will be familiar with that. But again, if a committee recommends a lower and the company wants to impose a higher standard, company will not be able to do that without giving the accused an opportunity. Because there, the recommendation is for a lower. And if the company was to impose a higher penalty, it will have to give the person an opportunity by higher punishment being ordered.
Oh, okay. Got
It
that.
may do so if it rules provide, but it cannot do without giving him an opportunity. And it may not stand in every case the test.
Okay.
So a lower measure is one thing in accordance with the rule, but a higher measure you cannot do without an opportunity, because then that's a report. The report puts the onus and a test at a certain level.
Okay. So now, since you brought in the aspect of minor and major cases, ma'am, so usually it is the victim's perception, that IC looks at, yes. But for an IC to even go in for the recommendations, how do you think IC should look at cases which are minor and major? what is the basis that they should, on which they should decide whether a case is a minor case, which can be handled through a conciliation, or a major case, which requires a full-fledged inquiry? So some guidelines, if you can share on how the IC should look at the case which gets registered in terms of minor and major.
Okay, now let us look at some illustrations there uh, to make it out as a minor and a major case. Let us take a case of a, where it is said, let me say there's an allegation of a physical contact. All right. The victim says, I feel this is an inappropriate touch. And the accused says it was, even if it was something, it was accidental and I had no intention. And it's, it's maybe reported a couple of times, but nothing more than that. Or for example, let me say a sexually colored remark, which is made in a larger gathering or in a sudden bravado kind of a thing. Now, they are one of two off cases generally, but they are not a recurrent part. You perhaps can take them into conciliation and then treat them accordingly. See the gravity. Is it again and again recurring? Is it a consistent behavior or is it a one-off behavior? But where you come down to, unwelcome physical conduct of a sexual nature, or where there are demands of sexual favors, or sexual favors that will have a direct impact with your career, that your career progress cannot happen unless you give this sexual favors, and those become now much more serious kind of offenses, which you may not have a, where the nuance may be entirely very, very different. So you will have to look at it as the minor ones, one off, you're not too sure in the cases. You can try with the conciliation. Very often things can be cleared out there, and that is why the conciliation part is provided under the new act. Under the act, they provided for a conciliation before you can move into those. But normally in a gross cases of harassment, where there are physical contacts, where there are cases of pornography, or there are verbal and non-verbal conduct of sexual nature, asking for favors, you're not likely to have a settlement there.
Okay. Thank you, ma'am. So now, since we were talking also about conciliation, so lots of cases today, ma'am, in our experience, do get settled through the process of conciliation. Of course, at the request of the aggrieved woman, and mostly in corporates, all that a woman wants is that the behavior should stop. Most of the time, the women come to us saying, I just want this behavior to stop. So we go with the conciliation, and that's how the cases do get closed, right? So IC intervenes, conciliates, and settles it with maybe just an apology or a warning or whatever. We were looking at, we were talking to NCW representative, where they were saying that there is a recommendation gone, to where the recommendation reads out like this. The provision of conciliation should be done away with, as sexual harassment is not a dispute that can be resolved with settlement, as it may force a woman to withdraw to keep the sanctity of the organization. Now, since most of our cases are getting solved in corporates through conciliation, because all that a woman wants is just the behavior to stop. And what do you think, ma'am, on this? Do you think this recommendation would be valid, or there would be a lot of backlashes coming in if this conciliation is removed?
No, I think conciliation must stay. Conciliation must stay. Sometimes there are perceptions which get cleared also in a conciliation. And you are right, most of the time what woman wants is an environment where she can function. She does not want harassment. It's in gross cases of harassment that she also wants to go through with the process of an ICC, complete the full dress, report and investigation into it. Because it's not very good for her either. the whole procedure can be also equally daunting for her as it will be for an accused. So
Absolutely.
if there is a conciliation and the employer does take those measures, there is an apology that is tendered, there is an assurance that is given that the conduct will not resume. You can always put people in separate areas where they do not come in contact with each other, put them in a different departments if you have an opportunity, different areas of work. And of course, with an assurance that this will not repeat, it can resolve a lot of things, leave a workplace much more conducive than to have an aggravated thing. I think the conciliation is a very good thing, because let me tell you, that's also one reason when the original Vishakha guidelines were framed and taken from SIDA, we were not in favor of having even a criminal action there. Because we do feel that it is important to recognize that this is an act of sexual harassment, to protest against it, to bring an awareness that it is a conduct which is an unacceptable conduct. But very often it can be solved through conciliation rather than taking it through the other pendulum altogether. So I would personally say that conciliation is a very good factor if it works in cases.
Great. Thank you so much, ma'am. Now, there is also an extension to this question. We have had women, in fact, who have come to us and told that they wanted to be solved through conciliation, a case, but it's actually from the IC's perspective, it's quite a major sexual harassment case. So how should the IC then look at it? Should we go by the conciliation request of the woman, or should the IC look at their judgment and take it to a full-fledged inquiry? So what do you suggest on that, ma'am?
There are you can use innovative ways of dealing with it. Perhaps the woman does not want to go through with that entire investigation before the IC, where there are witnesses, where are statements recorded, and the reports coming, and how much ever confidential you keep it, within the organization, people do come to know and they do talk. So very often women do not want that particular situation, and they do not want to go through with the trauma of reliving that whole thing. And they are very happy to have a conciliation, close the chapter, not to do it again and move on with it. But if the offense is of a fairly serious nature, the organization on its own can take notice of it. Even if the IC does not do it. It does not stop the employer from taking serious note about it. Employer has his own ways of dealing with that. Maybe because if the woman's not interested in going through an inquiry, what purpose will it serve for the internal complaints committee if she does not come forward then? If she comes forward and becomes a part of the inquiry, you can take it to its logical conclusion and you can give a report. But if she does a conciliation and she's not willing to come forward before the committee with her material or her witnesses or her statement, then there's nothing that the committee can do. So irrespective whether it's a serious offense or it's a small offense, the committee will be handicapped in giving its report. And that's a best judgment assessment that a committee will have to make at that stage. What's the maximum that it can get out of it? The committee can bring about a settlement and give a report to an employer to say, we brought this settlement, but we do feel the conduct is of a serious nature and the management should see that it doesn't.
Oh, lovely. That was lovely, ma'am. Thank you so much. I mean, if you look at the INBA survey as well, I mean, we keep a tab on all the surveys that are being done on sexual harassment at workplace. And the INBA survey claims that 70% of women at workplace do not complain of sexual harassment, as you rightly said earlier as well. Now, this could be fear of retaliation, scared about the confidentiality, not wanting to go through the entire process, distrust sometimes in the IC itself, or no faith in the mechanism per se. It could be any one of these reasons. So how do you think management of companies, can address this particular issue? How can they make how can they make employees trust in them and make them come forward to use this, opportunity of, reaching out to the IC? How do you think management of companies can solve this issue of women not coming forward in complaining, ma'am?
See, first of all, you do within your company have to build up a sense of confidence amongst the women employees, and including with the men. It's very important to do regular exercises and workshops to make people aware of what is an unacceptable conduct at a workplace. Uh, it's been my experience that sexual harassment actually is an unacceptable code of conduct at a place of work, completely, you know. So that's one thing that atmosphere has to be created, that conduct of this nature is not going to be tolerated. So the minute you do that particular exercise, you instill a sense of confidence within the women that a management means that they will not accept the conduct. You would note that at the lower levels, there is not so much an issue unless the complaint comes to or in respect of a person who's at a very senior managerial level or at a high level. Very often, the problems do come up is where women have very often come and reported that if their complaint is against somebody in the position of power, then the then there is an inherent resistance. Number one, first of all, they're hesitant to complain. Once they complain, they have a complete doubts on the ICC constitution because they are not very happy with the constitutions of the committee, then they have a problem. Now, if the management has a committee which has already been constituted and is there for a certain period of time, thereafter, if a complaint comes against ABC, whether it's highest management, mid management, or the lowest, nobody can doubt your committee because that's a common committee that is working.
Lovely.
Because the management can also turn around and say, look, we have not constituted a committee specially in this particular case. This is a committee which is looking into all the complaints. What happens is when you start constituting an ad hoc committee for a case against a senior managerial person or have another managerial committee for a lower level employee, that is where you're going to have doubts being cast on your complaints committee that you have constituted. And that doubt comes very often even in your co-opting an external person within the persons who are within that organization. So therefore, I said insulate your committee. Insulate your committee. The minute you insulate your committee, you will have probably more sense of confidence among the women to come forward and report.
Lovely. Now, I think we were discussing about the false cases in the afternoon, ma'am. So another question is regarding the false complaints. I understand the act is benefiting a lot of women at workplaces because I can hardly remember in so many years of the act coming into force. In my experience, I can hardly remember maybe a case or two which was false and malicious out of the scores of other real cases that we did handle. So ACT is helping a lot women at workplaces today. But now also looking at the false cases, suppose we as IC have enough evidence to prove that a lady had raised a false complaint or had raised a complaint with vengeance or malicious intent. And if it is proven by the IC, the question is, can we go ahead and take a disciplinary action which is as severe as what we take for a man who is found guilty? So can that be equal when we take, or does the law look at women a little more milder way? So your inputs on that, man.
The law does tend to look at women in a more mild way, but I will not forget one thing. That while it is very necessary to protect women at place of work, and the act is to their advantage, a false complaint or a malicious complaint causes a huge, huge damage to the accused. It is his image that is dented. It is his self-esteem also that is affected. So I think it is extremely unfair when false complaints are made. Number two, I have a serious issue, speaking for myself, this is, on false complaints being made. You know, when the Me Too movement started, and I'm for one for the Me Too movement because it gave women a lot of encouragement to come about and speak about their experiences of harassment, which may not have been in recent times, but much older ones too. But it brought in all kinds, with evidence or without evidence. Okay. Now, the ones which were complaints that were being just flung around, it also brought down a lot of credibility into the loss of credibility, because it was said that now anyone can come and start talking and making a complaint. So on one hand, it was an empowerment from the sense of numbers, because women were being open and there was nothing to feel about. On the other hand, you had a lot of people who started to disbelieve that why were you not talking about it for so long? Why have you come up with it now? So the negative part was to get loss of credibility. The same thing goes with the false complaint. When a false complaint is brought about, it leads to a loss of credibility in the system, in the complainant, and puts you on your guard in terms of false complaints. Because always the defense of an accuser is going to be it's a false complaint. But the damage caused to this is much more. Now, let me give you an illustration. Every single day in criminal courts, you have false complaints which are filed under section 406, breach of trust, 420. The matters go on merrily in the court. Eventually, the complaint may be allowed or dismissed. It is between the two parties and done with. But when you come with a false complaint now under the new laws, which only are now recognizing your rights are there, your rights were always there, but these are now kind of articulated into the statutes. So just like 498A, which was the dowry claims and dowry debts, the rights came, you did not have a provision for alimony. So all complaints under 498A were uncle, aunt, father, mother, sister, brother-in-law, everybody misbehaved with me and demanded dowry. And all of them were roped in as criminals. It went to an extent that Supreme Court started saying, you will not arrest anyone in a complaint under 498A, immediately release them. These complaints cannot be made against distant members. Now, mind you, one of them or two of them may be true, but everybody got affected because of that. So I always say, be very careful. Please do not dilute the law. Your false complaint will result, and do not take this the 498 way at all. The false complaints will cause more damage to the women as such in the larger perspective than just to take an action against that one woman. But the law recognizes that you can take action against her.
Okay.
Because it is a damage which is false to the self-esteem of the other person.
Absolutely.
In a false complaint.
Right. Because
I have a different perspective why I say false complaints should be avoided scrupulously. Because we've seen what has happened to 498A. It was a very good law. It is a very good law for protection of women. But the misuse of that law is what it stands at today.
Sure. Because I remember in one of the false cases, just that I think that was one of the major false cases that we proved, because we had 32 witnesses coming in, giving witness against women.
I can't hear.
Oh, okay.
I can't hear you. I think there was a bad connection. Okay. Can you repeat that?
Yeah. Am I audible now?
Yeah, you're audible now.
Okay. So I remember having a case, ma'am, where because of a false complaint, of course, we proved it was false because we had 28 or 32 witnesses coming and giving their statements against the woman, saying why it was false. And we had enough evidences and we proved. But the man actually, he came forward saying that I want the IC to publish it on notice board everywhere, saying that this is the woman who falsely implicated me. I need justice. And he started, crying. He started shouting, saying that his name is gone, and it had a bigger impact on him. So I can imagine what kind of an impact it has on the person on whom the false case has been raised. So at that point in time, there was a lot of debate on how strict can we go in terms of, taking a disciplinary action.
See, damage to somebody's reputation, name, self-esteem, self-worth is a huge, huge issue. Not a small measure. Let's not forget that. And I think women must be equally responsible when they make their complaints. They
Right.
must be equally responsible. And again, there is a need for them to understand. There is a need to do your sessions to make them aware how to build their evidence so that they can take their complaints through. You know, the contemporaneous speaking with friends, with colleagues, with recordings, etc., so that even the ICC is empowered to then take the matter to its logical conclusion. These matters are very often very hard to prove because they happen in isolation. So, you know, there will be material on both sides, and of course you will may believe women's version because they will always say that, well, there can be nobody there at that point in time because this has happened in a place where there is no other witness, etc. But it's a very hard job also for the ICC with conflicting evidence. So there has to be some kind of in-house training, and let men also be aware that, you know, if they indulge in that conduct, women have a means to build up that kind of an evidence to take it forth.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am. So now coming to another recommendation that has been forwarded from NCW, because we were having a webinar wherein there was a representative from NCW, and she was telling that there's a recommendation which has gone to raise the time taken to complaint, which is now 3 months for a woman. So the recommendation has gone to increase it to 6 months, right? So, what are your thoughts on this, ma'am? Would that be too long a period? Can there be loss of evidence? So we just wanted to understand how justifiable it is to have it for 6 months.
You know, it cuts both ways. One thing is, yes, of course, there is a loss of evidence. And if in 6 months you feel you are not ready to take an action, but 6 months is not too much of a time.
Okay.
The normal law in terms of any complaints or anything does give a reasonable time. But also understand that in matters of sexual harassment, it's very hard for a woman to come forward and to make a complaint. You know, I was personally all right with the 3 months limit because 3 months is a recent past. The committee has the advantage of all contemporaneous material coming before it to make its assessment and evaluate. But if the legislature thinks it should be 6 months, 6 months, I would have definitely spoken out if it was a year. That would have been completely no-no. Completely no-no. But according to me, 30 days or 45 days are good enough. You don't have to go beyond that. You don't need to actually go beyond that because it's a good time. But don't forget that where there is a recurring actions, then you may have an act which has been continuing for a fairly long time. Then even the last 3 months will give you a cause of action to bring a complaint.
Right.
You know, if it's a recurring action, then it could be even for 1 year the victim could have been. But it's enough for her to show the last 3 months action and say, I still have a recurring action and I'm here. So actually, it's not going to make much of a difference in a case of a recurring action.
Okay. Great. Ma'am, one more question is regarding the appeal. So any woman today, or for that matter, any person who is not happy with the way the management has implemented the recommendations of the IC as an option to appeal today to the appellate authority. But
Yes.
today, I think none of the organizations are, I mean, most of the organizations are a little apprehensive as to how this appellate authority works. What is the procedure of, approaching this appellate authority? And, what is the process that they follow to kind of, settle this matter with the aggrieved person? How does that entire appellate authority and the mechanism work, ma'am, in reality?
The appellate authority works like any court procedure now.
Okay.
It's like a regular court appeal. So it is where you will put the entire material before and it's going to be the first authority, remember that. So they have an opportunity to go through the evidence and reappreciate the evidence. That's the one thing that you should note.
Okay.
So the ICC, whatever, ICC would come to its finding and its report on the basis of certain material and evidence before it. Number one. Number two, ICC would have followed a certain procedure to do it. Now, either the appreciation of evidence is not, the appellate authority can take a different view of appreciation of that evidence because it's the first appeal that is there. Number two, if the procedure is not fully followed, for example, principles of natural justice, then also there will be an issue.
Sure. Is there any timeline?
Yeah. Again, if ICC considers incidents which are more than a year old, but there's nothing in recent past, that also will be something which will be wrong. So all this will become a part of the appeal.
Okay. So is there any timeline from the appellate authority side as to within so and so time the appellate authority has to close it as far as the aggrieved party is concerned, or because we couldn't see anything in the act regarding that?
No,
Okay.
because you see the appeal that here it goes is to the court or the tribunal. So
Right.
that is not bound by a timeline, unlike your committee is. But there is a timeline to file your appeal, which is 90 days.
90 days, that's
Which
right.
is 90 days.
Right.
So it's like a normal this thing, it's like a provision for a statutory appeal. Almost.
Right, right. So thank you so much, ma'am. So my questions are over. So we just had, I will just take up one question from our audience where I felt it was quite a different question. So I'll air it out. I'm sure this will be the first time that you would have also heard this. So we have a company who has asked if the organization from the CSR perspective has kept menstrual cup orientation programs for both men and women together. And because of that session, if there is unwanted gossips originating by men towards women, should the organization look at that issue as a posh issue, or should they look at it more from a workplace related issue and take it further?
See, there are two things that I would want to know. That is a CSR project that organization is doing. Is the organization engaged in manufacture, or is dealing with, or in that particular area? Look, if you're doing that issue with men and women together as a part of your workshop training of your employees, you are professionals. Okay, then it doesn't matter whether you have men and women together participating in something that they have to go and deliver in the market or carry out their work, etc. So I think it's a workplace related issue. But if the fallout of such an action, you have some sexually colored remarks. Now let us take an illustration coming from there. You have certain sexually colored remarks which are made by some participants for the women members who are present there. That could become an issue of sexual harassment at place of work. The conduct of a session together is by no means an act of any, it can only be at best a workplace issue. But if some of your persons who are in that particular training workshop choose to make sexually colored remark using this as a topic of discussion, then you could have a then you may have an issue which may come and which can fall within the meaning of sexual harassment, but that will go on a case to case basis.
Sure. So thank you so much, ma'am. It was just absolutely lovely talking to you. And we wish you all the luck for all the work that you are continuously doing for women and children. And we really appreciate your dedication towards this. And I can't thank you enough for sharing such valuable inputs, with our audience today. So thank you once again, ma'am. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much for having me here. I don't know because that's a legal side of it, how useful it is for the people.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Thank you for. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajesh.